Hey guys, welcome back to Reignited. Now I apologize if I'm not having the usual energy I normally have in these videos. I am still currently recovering from COVID here, so you're gonna hear me coughing a little bit, so I apologize for that. But we're trying to get some actual work done here. We're trying to get back out in the shop, and we're continuing to work on our brand new 05 Magnum project. Now in our last episode you saw that we went ahead and bore scoped the cylinders, and we saw that we did in fact have some drop valve seats in here, exactly what we were expecting. So in this episode we're gonna continue with our engine teardown process and actually identify what all components need to be changed to get this thing fixed and back up and running again. That's the idea for this one. Now, I've shown this process a couple of times before, but let's go ahead and run through it real quick as far as what exactly we're gonna take out. Now, normally in this instance, I would actually pull the engine immediately because I would know that I'd have to replace pistons or something like that. In this case, I'm wondering if, because it really seems like the engine shut off almost immediately when this happened, we might have gotten a little bit lucky here with our pistons, and because obviously there is damage to the pistons, but in this case, because I am just trying to get the engine back running again to perform some other tests, we may be able to get away with not actually pulling the engine at this time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm gonna go ahead and remove the cylinder heads from here. That way we can physically inspect the bores and the pistons themselves and see if we can salvage it as is without actually pulling the engine at this time. Now rest assured, this engine will be completely gone through because we're going to be doing some major modifications from here forward. But at this time, if I can get it just back running again, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Now, as you can see, I went ahead and removed the hood for this vehicle and put it on top of the roof there. That's not really a necessary step. You don't actually have to do that. However, there's a couple of advantages to it. One is that it makes access a lot greater in here. And two, if you actually get to the point where you need to actually remove the engine from the vehicle, it certainly helps a lot because the cherry picker arm will generally start to contact the hood very quickly when you're going to try to remove it. So just flipping it up and leaving it on the roof, I think it's a great option. Obviously, it's not available to everybody. There's a lot of people who don't have a shop or a garage to work inside of. You're working outside. So you want to leave the hood on to prevent water from getting down in there if it rains or something like that. Completely understand. But for my instances, and especially for filming purposes, it really makes a lot of sense to actually just remove the hood altogether. So the next step here that I talk about all the time in these videos is if you're dealing with a Charger, Challenger, or a 300, you'll want to remove this cowl panel. The access is so much better back here once you remove this. It only takes about 10 minutes to get all this stuff out of the way. All you're doing is you're removing the wiper arms, you're removing the cowl panel itself, and you're removing this strut brace bar essentially that goes all the way across. You get that out of the way and all of a sudden you have such greater access to the back of the engine here so you can get to all those bolts that seem to be really difficult to get to with this in place. As soon as you take this out, everything's a breeze to get to. Even the upper bell housing bolts, all of that, if you do end up pulling the engine out altogether, such better access. So, I don't know if you can tell from the video or not, but I do also have the vehicle up on jack stands so that I can get to all the bolts underneath, start draining any fluids that need to be drained. But in any case, let's move forward getting this cowl panel removed. This next tip is one I feel like I've given on my channel quite a bit before, but it always seems like there's somebody new who hasn't heard it before. And it's regarding removing the windshield wiper arms from a vehicle. Now this applies to almost every single vehicle out there, not just Dodges and things like that. But basically it's a tapered stud that these things go down onto. So as you tighten the nut, it really starts to crimp down on there. It's very much like a ball joint or a tie rod or something like that. So they can be really difficult to remove. They don't like to come off. That one unfortunately came right off. Let's pretend like that didn't happen. Now, usually these things are stuck on here really, really tight. And you could be yanking and pulling on these things as hard as you can and it feels like they are not coming free no matter what. The key to this is just breaking that seal of that tapered fit. That's all you gotta do. So what you end up doing is you put pressure here on this portion of the windshield wiper arm, you push on that and it actually pivots on that tapered fit and actually breaks that free. And as soon as you kind of break it free a little bit, generally they will come right off. How about this passenger side one? Okay, so this one is definitely stuck on there a little bit more. You can see I'm yanking on it pretty good. We're not getting any movement off of there. So all you gotta do, like I said, put some pressure right here. So you can see it start to move. Boom, pops right off. So again, just a great tip for everyone. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying this fresh Hemi Magnum content I've got for you. But I want to let you know that for the next 2 weeks, we're doing a pre-order for our brand new merchandise drop. Now, as you guys know, we just recently redesigned our logo, so we wanted to update all of our apparel on the site with a new logo. And we know how difficult it is to find decent automotive inspired apparel, so we tried really hard to make this something you guys would really want to wear and also be representing and supporting the brand as well. I try not to ask too much from you guys. However, in this instance, I want to let you know that if you feel like this channel has provided some value to you or has really helped you out in your life, some good advice, something like that, please, by all means, click the link in the description down below. Go check out what we got and at least see if it's something you'd be interested in. Every single dollar that comes from this is gonna go right back into the channel. This is not some third-party deal. My wife and I are handling all of this ourselves. So like I said, every dime that comes from these apparel sales is going right back into the channel as far as providing some new content for you guys. And I wanna make it clear that everyone who gets involved in this pre-order will be receiving a discount. So those details will be down in the description below. As it stands, guys, whether you buy something or not, I always appreciate all of your support. It has meant the world to me so far. Let's get back to this project. Now, there's two different sections of this cowl panel here. There's a small panel right here that actually just covers over the PCM. Then there's a primary panel that goes all the way across. Now, the primary panel just has a number of these little Christmas tree push pins. They use a trim tool. Just get into there. Pop those guys right out of there. So there's a number of those all the way along the edge. And in the corners here, there's a little Phillips head screw plastic type thing that essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to turn it 90 degrees because it's just a lever that flips underneath of the windshield here that actually holds this thing in place. 9 times out of 10, this little plastic screw will strip out as you're trying to remove it. So my advice would be to get all of the other fasteners free, and then as it's mostly loose, you can kind of jiggle it a little bit and get it to spin on its own, even if that screw is stripped out, enough to actually get the cowl panel off of there. Now that the cowl panel is out of the way, you can see that there is just this strut brace bar going all the way across. Now, one thing to be on the lookout here for is that you have your PCM is the bracket is actually bolted to this bar, so you just need to undo these bolts here for the strut bar, and this thing will lay back to the side. One thing to note here, you've got this little tab that comes off of the cowl panel. This is where your cabin air filter goes. It's very easy to break this tab by trying to force this bar in and out of here, so just be very careful with that. The last thing to note is that over here, this is your windshield wiper motor. The lower tab coming off of this brace here is what supports the bottom of this motor, but there's no bolts or anything. It's just a grommet that slides into place. So you just gotta slide that out of there. Then this whole bar comes out of here, and I will show you how much more room you have once that's removed. Just that easy. Now you got that bar out of there, and look at the access that that gives you to the back side of the engine and any of the hoses or any sort of bolts or bracketry you need to get to back there. I absolutely feel like it's worth the couple of minutes it takes to pull that stuff off of there. Now at this point, we're just dealing with general disassemblies. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove the whole intake system here. I'm going to remove the intake manifold, all the coils and the wires and things like that. And then after that, I think the next step will be valve covers. We're gonna do rocker arms, push rods, all that sort of thing. Like I said, we're just gonna pull the cylinder heads off in this episode, get a better look at exactly what was damaged when these valve seats failed. Now this hose back here is one that I feel a lot of people forget when they're actually doing this repair. This is your brake booster hose on the back of the manifold. So when you're putting this thing all back together again, it's really easy to overlook this particular hose. Don't. This is a big one and it'll cause a huge vacuum leak, and also your brakes won't work. So just remember that you have this hose on the back of the manifold. So as is usually the case with stuff like this, once we get the manifold off, you can see there's some signs of some rodent living underneath here. You know, very, very common. A lot of times the only issue that we run into there is that they will like to chew on the harnesses that run underneath here. So once we get this thing all cleaned up and the cylinder head's off, we'll go ahead and inspect that harness, make sure there's no rodent damage to it before we put things back together again. All right, we got the majority of that loose stuff out of the way, got the manifold off. I went ahead and pulled out the radiator fans just to give myself enough room to slip in here to get some of these forward accessories off. Now it's time to actually pull the cylinder heads themselves. We're gonna go ahead and get these valve covers off. Let's go ahead and get the rocker arms off, the push rods out. Let's go ahead and then we'll take like a cursory inspection from the top side, see if there's anything that's kind of weird. I'm not expecting to find anything, but see if we see anything a little strange from the top side here. And then we'll go ahead and pull the cylinder heads off themselves. Oh, and I'm also draining the coolant out of there. However, doesn't matter how much you drain the coolant on these things, you're going to have a certain amount of coolant that's in the cylinder heads, in the block itself. So when you pull these cylinder heads off, you're gonna make a mess. That's just the way it is. Sometimes these valve covers can be stuck on here pretty good due to heat, so we'll go ahead and use a little pry bar action. Get ourselves some leverage. There we go. But you can hear that was stuck on there pretty good, so without that pry bar, it probably wouldn't have popped off like that. You probably yank on that for a while and it won't move. Unsurprisingly, we got a little bit of slop here on our cylinder number 1, the intake side, where that valve seat has fallen out. So there's just no more tension there anymore. I am encouraged though by what I'm seeing here so far. Now it is definitely tighter here on the passenger side than it is on the driver's side to get these lower valve cover bolts out of there. However, you just have to have kind of an assortment of long and short sockets and wobbly sockets and extensions, and you'll find some combination that works to get to all those bolts that hold the valve cover on. So I'm very pleased with what I'm finding so far. When I went ahead and pulled all this apart, you can see that this engine has had very regular oil changes. Everything looks great inside. The push rods are in perfect shape, no bent push rods, nothing like that. So I think we could be in for a fairly easy fix. Now, one thing to keep in mind with these Hemi engines, when you are pulling the cylinder heads, you go ahead and leave the exhaust manifolds attached to the cylinder heads. You can see how tight the access is in here, and it's very, very difficult to actually remove these exhaust manifolds with the head still on the vehicle. You can do it, but it's such a pain in the butt. It's not necessary. Leave them on the cylinder head and pull it all out as one unit. So that being the case, all you have to do is unbolt the 2 bolts that hold the exhaust manifold to the Y pipe itself. Once you get those off, then just undo the cylinder head bolts. Whole thing comes off as one unit. So you'll have to unplug the upper O2 sensor because that again comes with the whole unit. But other than that, that's all there is to it. So we're pretty much at that point now. I'm gonna hop underneath the vehicle and undo the exhaust manifold bolts, and then I'll undo the head bolts from up here. We'll get these things out of here. So you want to go ahead and remove the head bolts from the cylinder head before you actually try to remove it from the vehicle. Otherwise, it'll just get stuck on them when you're trying to pull it off of there. So go ahead and remove these guys first. Then you'll probably have to pry on it just a little bit to break the seal with the head gasket, and then try to just yank it up all out of there as one piece. Now, it's a bit finicky. There's a little bit of a trick to it as far as the angle in which it needs to come out of there, but you'll figure it out as it comes out. Again, just make sure that your O2 sensor is disconnected, and then you have all the cylinder head bolts out, including these little guys, the little 10 mil guys up top. Let's go ahead and break the seal on this guy. All right, as you see, it's gonna pour coolant all over the floor. I have a drain pan, but it's probably only gonna catch a tiny portion of it. All right, probably gonna get caught on the head gasket a little bit here. There we go. All right, got her. I admit, doing this without my regular tools or a lift is not nearly as much fun. I mean, I'm also still recovering from sickness, so that has something to do with it. Well, we almost got away with one here, guys. So on this side here, where the valve seat had fallen out, it had not yet been impacted by the piston, and the piston is actually okay. Same with cylinder number 7 back here, that the valve seats were in the process of falling out, but had not yet actually exploded yet. So these were okay over here. However, on this side, cylinder number 8, you can see here that valve seat did in fact impact the piston, and these little bits and pieces you see down here, this is the valve seat itself now that it is exploded, and unfortunately ended up taking the chunk out of the side of our piston here. So I was hoping we'd get away with a miracle here and not have to actually pull the engine, but we do need to pull the engine to replace at least cylinder number 8 piston back there, and then we can slap this thing back together again. Now here is our cylinder head on the driver's side. You can see that the intake seat is falling out there, and what's actually really cool, that exhaust seat is in the process of falling out, and this intake and exhaust seat are both in the process of falling out, but have not yet fallen all the way out. So there could have been a whole lot more damage happening there. Anyway, pretty cool. Hadn't actually seen that before. Usually they're just all blown up by the time I see them. So here on the passenger side, this is what happens when they fully explode. You can see that the intake valve seat is gone. That valve is sitting way too deep down in there, and it has smashed into the piston and torn up the cylinder head surface. And also you can see that the exhaust seat was in the process of falling out on this cylinder as well. The other cylinders look okay, but it doesn't really matter. This cylinder head is basically a loss. It's not, you can fix this, but realistically, it's not even worth doing. It's better to just go with another OEM cylinder head or a reman at this point. Now, that whole process of pulling the cylinder heads off this engine took me about 2.5 hours, which is honestly a ridiculously long period of time. I'm blaming it on 2 things. 1, that I don't have my normal lift here, and more importantly, 2, that I'm still feeling quite the effects of being sick. So I just have really low energy, and it's been difficult to move at the pace I normally move at. So honestly though, 2.5 hours to get cylinder heads off, not a big deal. Then you can kind of see where you stand as far as what all you're going to need to replace with the engine. Now, the last thing we need to do here after I get the bits cleaned out of that cylinder number 8, I'm gonna go ahead and spin the engine over a couple of rotations. I'm going to inspect each and every cylinder to make sure that the cylinder itself has not been damaged by the debris running through it. Now, a huge thing to remember here is if you do have a valve seat that has been shattered and exploded like we have on cylinder number 8 there, your intake manifold is essentially useless. You need to buy a new intake manifold. And the reason for that is that as soon as one of these valve seats explodes, those bits and pieces of metal actually shoot up into the intake manifold. Now, the intake manifold has a series of twists and turns inside of it where that metal can become trapped in there, and no amount of cleaning will actually clear that metal out. And in fact, you'll think you have all of it out, like every little bit of it out. If you put that intake back on your engine and run it, more often than not, that metal will find its way back into a cylinder and you'll be right back where you started. So I do not recommend using your original intake manifold if you do have an exploded valve seat. I highly recommend buying a new intake manifold, or at least a used one where this has not happened yet. All right, this is what we're looking for here. I went ahead and spun the engine over a couple of times, rotated it. You're looking to see if it actually damaged the cylinder wall. Now you can see here some very, very light markings here. Those are very, very light. You can't feel those with a fingernail at all. Basically, these will come out with a light hone, no problem at all. So we basically just have to slap a new piston in here and be good to go. That's really the breakover point you're looking at with one of these engines. Once you drop a valve seat, the first thing you gotta do is pull those cylinder heads to see how damaged the cylinder walls are. In this case, the cylinder walls are going to be fine, no problem at all. You can still see the factory cross hatching in there. It looks great. Just a light hone will bring these things right back to life again. So not concerned about that. Now, A lot of times when people have these valve seat failures, they'll keep cranking that engine over because they're not sure exactly what happened, so they're trying to make the thing run again. But unfortunately, at that point, you just have a bunch of metal bits in that cylinder, and all you're doing is grinding them up, and grinding them into the cylinder walls and making things so much worse. So if you do have this happen to you with your Hemi engine, shut the thing off immediately. And to my great happiness, that absolutely appears to be the case here. It seems like whenever this thing actually failed, that they just shut it down and didn't spin it over after that. So it could have been better in some ways, but in many cases, we really ended up in good shape here. I'm pretty happy with this. Again, we still have to pull the engine all the way out so we can replace that one piston in there, but it's probably for the best anyway. So I'm gonna yank this thing out of here. I don't know if this will be in this episode or in the next episode, but I'm gonna get this engine yanked out of here, throw a new piston in there, slam this thing back together again so we can do those Hellcat oil pump tests. So let's talk a little bit more about why exactly this problem is happening. I think that's the question I get asked most often. Why does this happen, and what can I do to help prevent this on my vehicle? Well, as I showed you kind of an up close here, we know that these valve seats are made out of steel, and of course the cylinder heads are aluminum, so you have dissimilar metals. Now when that is the case, they expand and contract at different rates based on heat. Now, when these things end up overheating, the cylinder head expands far enough to allow that steel seat to fall out of place. Now, basically, that just comes down to improper tolerances as far as machining goes on the cylinder head. I think they just opened it up a thousandth or two just too much, and that means that under extreme heat situations that these seats will fall out. Now, pretty much all the remanufactured heads that you will get for these things have solved this problem. And also an important note is on the Eagle heads and up, so 2009 up, this valve seat issue is not a problem. This only affects the Hemi engines up through 2008. So that's another thing I like to point out. Sometimes people like to try to trap me on that and say, oh, well, you said this only happens to these and mine did it. I'm not saying that there can't be outliers, because there always are going to be outliers. I'm saying by and large, this problem only affects the ones up to 2008. 2009 on with those Eagle heads, they seem to have solved the problem. I have never personally seen a 2009 and later engine that had a valve seat failure like this, so you don't have to worry about it. And again, if you have remanufactured heads, likely that problem has also been solved as well. So moving on to the second part of that question, when people ask, how can I prevent this from happening? Honestly, I don't have a great answer for you. To be honest, if you have a pre-2009 vehicle Hemi engine, likely it's already got a decent amount of mileage on it already. There's a few low mileage examples out there, but most of them are 100,000+ miles anyway. And my only advice really is to make sure your cooling system is absolutely up to par. Make sure that you have a thermostat and water pump replaced on it recently. Make sure your coolant is good. Anything you can do to make sure these things are running at their proper temperature. That's the best preventative thing that you can do. I also get a lot of people who ask me, should I just go ahead and replace those cylinder heads before this issue actually happens, because you can see how catastrophic it can be if it damages pistons and in fact could damage the block. Obviously, that's worst case scenario, but it does happen fairly consistently with this. So people say, hey, should I just go in and replace these cylinder heads before that problem ever happens? And my answer used to be no. My answer used to be, as long as everything's working like it should and it hasn't happened to this point, don't worry about it, just drive the vehicle. However, I have to say that my thinking on that has changed. I do think that it makes sense that if you are keeping this vehicle long term, to go ahead and preventatively replace these cylinder heads with some reman units before this problem happens. Because like I said, even though the vast majority of these valve seat issues happen because of an overheating problem, I have had a number of people contact me and say, hey, my vehicle was not overheating and I just dropped a valve seat and it blew up and was a big old problem. So it is something that can happen just through normal operation. It doesn't happen very often, but it can. So if you have a Hemi vehicle prior to 2009 and you really like the vehicle and you want to hold on to it for long term, I do think it makes sense to actually replace the heads with a set of reman heads so you can kind of get that off your mind and you don't have to worry about it anymore. Now, as an alternative to actually replacing the cylinder heads with a set of reman units, which I still would recommend, I have heard of some guys, what they'll do is they'll remove the stock cylinder heads, take the valves out, and they'll actually stake those valve seats in place so that they can't actually fall out. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, they'll take a metal punch. This isn't really a punch, but essentially they'll take a metal punch and smack it with a hammer in the aluminum right next to the valve seat itself. And what that does is that it forces the soft aluminum up against the valve seat. And they'll do this in a number of spots, say 4 different spots. And this will allow it to put pressure all the way around against that valve seat, and that will prevent it from falling out if it does get too hot. Now, how successful are you with this? Honestly, I think it's a pretty good idea. It's something I kind of want to try and see. The problem is you won't know if you're actually getting results or not, because if the vehicle doesn't overheat, how would you know if you're actually fixing anything? But I do think it's a good preventative measure, and because I plan on working on some of these pre-2009 Hemis quite a bit, I do want to do it to at least one of them and just see, I don't know, see how it turns out and see how comfortable I am with it as a repair. But I do think that is a possibility. However, for peace of mind, I do think the best solution, if you can afford it, is go ahead and just swap the cylinder heads for a set of reman units. So I know a lot of you guys mentioned that you did want to see more detailed videos as far as this whole process is concerned. And I didn't really have a whole lot of tips and tricks for you on disassembly. It's just basic disassembly. All you're doing is unbolting things at this point to assess. Now, as this project moves forward and we start with the reassembly, that's when there'll be more tips and tricks involved. But if there was something in this video that I kind of skipped over or glanced over, you can do one of 2 things. One, you can watch my series right here on the black Chrysler 300. I went a bit more in depth on the disassembly process on that video. Or you can just ask me down in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer all the comments in this video. As far as if you feel like I skipped over something and you want some specific information on it, go ahead and ask that question. I'll do the best that I can to respond to it. Also, guys, if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. It does help me out a lot to actually start to build and grow the channel like I'm trying to do. I want to thank everyone who has watched everything to this point. I'm excited, guys. We're moving forward on this thing fairly quickly. We'll see you next time on Reignited.